This meeting is being recorded. That's a couple more people coming in. If everyone could please mute yourselves. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Meg Kaufman. I'm the head of outreach for the What Works Center for Local Economic Growth. And this is the second in a series of events that we are running on behalf of the Cities and Local Growth Team, the government, on COVID recovery from the COVID pandemic for places. And it's based on a series of work that we did during the pandemic, looking at the economic data and evidence that we had built up on more normal economic times, and trying to apply that to the situations the unique situation that we find ourselves in now, and advising places on how they can make the most of their COVID pandemic recovery policy in their local economy. So this is the What Works Center is one of the government's What Works Centers. We are the What Works Center for Local Economic Growth, and we are very much focused on evidence-based policy, like all of the What Works Centers, but our main focus is on local economies. And we have three different indicators that we focus on the most when we talk about local economic health, and that's wages, employment, and productivity. And productivity obviously is a huge issue for the UK. It has been for the last few years, but wages and employment are particularly important, and we kind of value them above other local economic measures, such as business churn or profitability, or property prices is another one that people look at a lot. But we think that that's a lot of those other indicators don't really measure what's happening for the people in the local economy. So that's why we always try and push things through to understanding the impact on wages and employment, because we think that that's what has the most impact for the people and the residents of any area. The other important thing I think to say about our perspective is that we are very much focused on local economies. And I think that this is an area, there's so much work done on the national economy and national economic policy. And I think sometimes the unique function of a local economy gets overlooked in a lot of the talk that goes on about economic policy. So we're very much focused on how the local economic dynamics and what we can do to improve those. I want to say that we're very much aware the high streets are multifaceted, and there's a lot going on the high street and a lot of different things that are important. We are focused on the economic aspects of that. So just to sort of set that out as a baseline for our approach today. Obviously, there are a lot of other things that are important, and I'm sure that Henry and Valentine are going to talk about those things as well. But from the What Works Center's perspective, we're focused on the economic health of the high street and the impact of the high street on the local economic well-being. Finally, we're recording this session. That's already been said, obviously, when you came in. Secondly, we really have left a lot of time at the end of the session for questions. So please do ask questions. The way to do it is to put them in the chat box. And then when the speakers are done, I'll go through what's in the chat box and ask people to unmute themselves and ask their questions. We are more interested in a lot of ways in what you think about what we're saying, and how it sits with you. So if things don't make sense, if you feel like it's wrong or we've missed something, please do put a question in the chat box and we will have time to discuss it at the very end. I think that's it for logistics. Today we have Henry Overman, who is the director of the What Works Center for Local Economic Growth. He's also the director of the Center for Economic Performance at LSE. He's going to talk about the evidence base that we have at the center and how it applies, as I said, to the unique economic situation that we find ourselves in and to the high streets. Then we have Valentine Quinio from the Center for Cities. She has been working on the High Streets Tracker for the Center for Cities for the last 12 months, 18 months. She has become a real expert on the dynamics of the high street. And she'll be talking about the tracker and what it tells us about high streets around the country. And she'll also have some other advice from work that Center for Cities have done on high streets over the years. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Henry.
Great, thanks. Let me share my screen. While I'm doing that, Meg, I should say you kindly promoted me. I'm the research director at CEP, not the director. You know, I'll take it. Okay, so As Meg, no, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Sharing fine. Okay, so I mean, as Meg said, the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth is concerned with what policy can do to drive local economic growth, with a particular focus on what we can do to improve people's wages, improve employment, or to improve the productivity of firms. And clearly all three of these are tied together. And is sort of in that context that I'm speaking to you. And I think high streets are really interesting in this context. So I'm going to sort of talk to you about how I think about high streets from a local growth perspective, and how it interacts with our work. But I think it's important to recognize that there's crucial aspects of high streets that, you know, don't sort of fit necessarily strictly within our remit. So I see what I'm going to say to you as complementing support that focuses on the sort of non-local growth aspects of the high street. So let me get a bit concrete on what I mean. So here is Rachel Wolf. She's actually speaking about levelling up, but she's talking about high streets. And I actually think this is, you know, a really important insight. So she says, people care deeply about where they live. They measure decline by their town or city centre. Here's what you hear time and time again. Shops boarded up, graffiti on the cenotaph, drug addicts, no monthly market, no decent playground. In other words, it's depressing to be in, feels mildly unsafe, and there's nothing to do. I mean, this is obviously her characterization, not necessarily mine. And then she goes on to note, it is crucial that economic investments, many of dubious effectiveness, do not trump these. And I think that's an important insight, and I want to pull that out a little bit in what we're going to talk about, and think about how the two-way interaction between high street strategy and local growth strategy. So, you know, if you're focusing on high streets in this way, I think this is very much the way the High Street Task Force focuses on it. So I actually spent a little bit of time in preparation for today's meeting, you know, checking where we were, the High Street Task Force. And, you know, I highly encourage, I'm sure people on the call will be aware of the work of the High Street Task Force, but if they're not, I do highly encourage you to go and look at it, because what I'm going to say is sort of complementary to the work that they're doing. And here's what I find interesting about the High Street Task Force. It's very focused on the things that Rachel Wolf is emphasizing here. So they have 237 factors that they feel influence success on the high street. I personally find that number mind-blowing. And I have some views on what I personally might do to reduce it down, which I'll be happy to, you know, chat about. But what I think is interesting is that they're very, very focused on what I would think of as an economist is about the supply side on the high street. So what are the opening hours? What's the mix of shops? What's the retail offer? What's the non-retail offer, etc.? And, you know, there is clearly a lot we can do there. But as Valentine's comments are going to show, what happens to the local economy can just blow this away. And I think the real challenge in this space is a lot of the immediate shock we're seeing from COVID and the longer run structural shocks that we're seeing are likely to be not particularly responsive to some of these supply side interventions. Oh, sorry, someone is unmuted and it's feeding back terribly for me. If everyone could check they're muted, that would be great. So here is the way I sort of think about this more from a local growth perspective. So we think about people, and in particular here, the demand that those people have for the high street. And the number one determinant of that is going to be about where they're working and how much income they have. Okay, so I'll come back to this in a minute. We also, though, think about things through the lens of business. So here, you know, we think about what do what can we do to change the productivity of individual retailers? And what do we know about what works in terms of getting businesses to adapt their business practices? And also, what can we do to attract new businesses into an area? And again, I think as Valentine is going to talk about, I'm guessing what you're talking about here, Valentine, but from what I've seen of your work, I think she'll also talk about the importance of having commercial and other employment in the surrounding area for the success of high streets. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And the other lens through which we cut is place. And here, I think I'll have less to say, although I will touch a little bit on some of the stuff that we, some of the evidence that we have. So on people, I guess I just wanted to emphasize a few things that come from the sort of local growth way of thinking about the success of high streets. And I've highlighted one of these already. So I do think that we need to pay a lot of attention to the spending power that people have in the local economy and how much of that money they are willing to spend locally. And one of the things that does strike me sometimes when we talk about high streets is that forget 237 factors. I give you my number one factor for whether or not a high street is successful, which is how high is the local income level. And I know that that is something that is, not always sort of fits with the remit of people who have the high street portfolio in a local area, but it's hugely important when you're thinking about how high streets fit with broader local economic strategy. So the number one thing we can do really to try and turn around what's going on for our local high streets is to have local economic strategies that boost local incomes. I think the second thing, again, which I'm sure Valentine is going to touch on, and I'm interested to see where people are, there's a huge amount of certainty generated at the moment by changing work patterns. And this is why I said that, what we do in terms of the location of other businesses, not retail businesses, nothing to do with the retail offer, just really literally where people are working and spend their working day will be hugely important. So that's one sort of set of things that I think we need to talk about. The other set of things where we, and so what Work Centre have a little bit more to say, is thinking about the visitor economy and the tourism economy. And here I think that the crucial thing is that nearly all of the evidence that we have says that if you're going to do stuff on visitors and things that try and get more visitors or more tourists in, the way to think about these is really, really just to focus on the impact that you have, directly. So there's a tendency to overcomplicate the way that people think about visitor attractions and tourism and cultural events and other sort of things as about repositioning the high street or rebranding it. I think all of this stuff is completely second order relative to being just very straightforward about how many visitors do you think you're going to generate through the policy and how much do you think they'll spend locally. And then I would add two things into the way that we try to encourage people to think about this, one of which is, would they have come on another day? And the fourth thing is, would they have gone and spent their money somewhere else in the local economy? Okay, so I think that's the sort of way that we approach displacement, that we approach visitor, tourism, cultural things, etc. The other thing I should say on this, by the way, in the context of COVID, of course, is that vaccine, travel rules, etc., are highly uncertain, and we've just seen that local areas can be buffeted by government, making announcements on its website on a Friday night about whether or not people will be able to go in and out of the area. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty to come here. The other thing I would say on sort of residents and visitors is that one thing that we do know, is specifically in the context of COVID, one thing that we do know is that, you can make sure that your your businesses make the most of central government schemes. It's really striking how much the take-up of Eat Out to Help Out varied across local authorities in the UK. And this, in effect, was a scheme that provided direct subsidy to businesses for really relatively little administrative cost. So that's some stuff on people. Just to say on a few things on businesses. By the way, Meg, I'm discovering that I can't see my clock with the slides up, so start sort of motioning at me if I'm going over. So one of the things that, turning to the business side, one of the things that we spend a lot of time on at the centre is that it's very easy to say in our strategies what we would like businesses to do to make them more productive. And a lot of your retail strategies will talk about things that you would like retail businesses to do when it comes to transforming your high street. The challenge is getting them to do it. And there is a large gap between wanting businesses to make a change and them actually making that change. And here there is a huge amount of advice on our website about what we know about how you achieve that. So I guess I'll highlight a few things here. So one of which is that I think at the moment the emphasis needs to be on light touch business support to try and change what businesses do. So this could be about helping them move online, or aspects of cleanliness, or take your pick of the many things you might want to do, get your shops to do. So I think it'll be need to be light touch, which is all right, because our evidence suggests that that can be effective. And the reason why I say this at the moment is not only do I think that that can be cost effective when we've got large numbers of firms to try and get behavioural change in, but also because I think that firms won't have time to do things that are more intensive. So other things that I would highlight supporting business is that it's very easy to think we'll put the infrastructure in place and businesses will respond. So I think the most obvious one on this is broadband. So, actually, anecdotally, I know talking to local shopkeepers around here that, there was a significant problem at the start of COVID of getting people connected to the internet. Retail firms connected to the internet, especially if they'd recently moved premises. But the crucial point here is, even if we tackle that, even if we get firms connected to the broadband infrastructure, we often need to think about what are the complementary incentives that we'll put in place. The third thing that I would just emphasize here is that a lot of what we're going to be doing here is supporting businesses that basically provide the local economy. And we do actually need to be really careful as policymakers not to play favorites, not to support some businesses at the expense of other local businesses. Partly because that's fair, but also partly because those kind of support is all really what economists would call zero sum. It's not going to benefit the high street as a whole. So I think that's a few things to bear in mind on business support. There are a few things to bear in mind also on attracting new businesses, although really I think that I'm going to let Valentine talk more about this. I do think that having a mix of non-retail uses will be important, not just for attracting people for businesses, but because of the demand they can generate. Actually, I won't touch on the accelerator and incubator stuff in the importance of time. The one thing I did think I'd touch on is anchor stores. So here is where I'll just loosely refer back to those 237 factors. I noticed as I was looking down those 237 factors that one of those 237 factors was the presence of anchor stores. Now, when you actually go and analyze the impact that anchor stores have on the local economy by looking at opening and closing of anchor stores, what you find is that the impact of them, the evidence is pretty mixed about whether or not they are good for employment in other surrounding firms. So I think that we have some evidence summarizing this, which you can go and have a look at. But I think it's important to realize that sometimes the factors that we might think intuitively are hugely important for the success of the high street don't play out so well when we go and look at sort of before and after comparisons and the evaluation evidence. I'm not going to touch so much on public realm. The kind of evidence that we look for really doesn't give us much of a sense that this has big employment, wage, or productivity impact. I think the economic benefits of public realm can be pretty muted. But I do agree, but the non-economic benefits can be really quite important. I suppose the other thing I would just pick up on the place side is that there are lots of decisions to be made around transport and the connectiveness of high streets. I think that COVID has already, there was a lot of uncertainty here, and I think that COVID has just exacerbated this. I will just flag the fact that we've got some evidence on our website on active travel schemes, which I know are often something that people consider when they're thinking about their high streets. Again, there I should say that most of the evidence that we have picks up pretty weak employment wage benefits of these active travel schemes, but it picks up, important health and non-economic benefits. So, really my feeling with these active travel schemes is that they're much more about those health and other benefits than they are about being able to drive large numbers of additional footfall on high streets. So let me conclude and leave lots of time for Valentine and then questions. I guess you'd get a feeling for the fact that I think there is a lot of noise and uncertainty at the moment. And I think, difficult as it is, that means we're going to have to maintain flexibility in whatever strategies we come up with at the moment. And I'll be interested to hear about how people are handling with that when we need to make sort of concrete decisions around infrastructure, etc. The second thing I'd say is, our website doesn't have lots of things on high streets, but it does have lots of things on activities that I think are complementary to whatever you're going to be doing with your high streets, and that I think are as, if not more important from a local economic growth perspective. So I've highlighted business support, public realm and the built environment, but there's a huge amount else out there. And I think that it's important to recognize that we do need a two-stranded approach. Things that are going to, tackle what's going on in the local economy, and provide sort of local economic growth type support, as well as doing things to make the high street less depressing, safer, and with more to do. Okay, I'll finish with a note of pessimism, just because I think it's probably important. I do think we need to be realistic about the underlying structural changes. I think that COVID will have just exacerbated all of these, and I think that we have got a lot of structural change that we're going to need to handle. And the idea that we can just go back to business as usual, I'm afraid for our high streets, is going to be a big ask. But the final thing I'll say is I really think that a thriving high street is as much a sign of local prosperity, much more than a cause of local prosperity. So I think you do the high street stuff because of what Rachel Wolf talks about. But I don't think that in itself is enough to sort of improve what's going on in the local economy in terms of people's wages, employment, etc. For that, I think you need the kind of complementary things I've been talking about. Meg, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Henry. A reminder, if anyone has any questions for Henry, go ahead and put them in the chat box and we will pick them up after we've heard from Valentine. And Valentine, over to you.
Thank you. Let me just share my slides. Can you see my slides?
I can now, yeah.
Right, let me just
not in full screen, but
there we go. Thank you for having me today, and yeah, Henry, that was a great tease of my presentation. So I'm part of the research team at the Centre for Cities, and so today I'll talk you through some of the findings that we've had in the past few months and years in the research on high street. So just a quick word on what we do. So we published a wide range of research on high streets, so some of them looking at the role city centres play in the economy, looking at why are some high streets struggling more than others in the country, and how cities differ from a consumer perspective. And back in June 2020, we launched this tool called the High Street Recovery Tracker. So the tracker includes footfall and spend data for the 63 largest city centres in the UK. And the point of the tool is to track recovery compared to pre-pandemic baseline. And we do that for a lot of different scores. So we have the overall recovery looking at all footfall, and then we have a breakdown for nighttime activity, for weekend activity, and for workers. And so, I mean, what I'll talk about today is just, a snapshot of what you can find on the tracker. So I very much encourage you to go and have a look if you haven't seen it before. And a quick word on the data. So the spend data comes from anonymized credit card offline. So this is physical kind of spend in city centers. And the footfall data comes from a mobile phone company called Locomizer. A quick word on the footfall data. Most other research, or I think a few local authorities use footfall based on cameras and sensors. And the interesting thing with the mobile phone approach is that you can not only see how many people are in a given space, but you can also see where they come from. And so the interesting thing we've seen in the tracker is looking at how different places, sort of catchment areas, have changed in the past few months. So looking at what we've learned using this data, so starting with the footfall. So the main pattern that we've observed on the footfall data, and we've seen that over time in the past year, is that first of all, city centers have coped differently with the pandemic. And the main story is that small and medium-sized city centers have recovered faster, which is what you can see on the chart here. So this looks at the overall footfall recovery over time since the pandemic hit up until September or the end of the year. And so there's a breakdown for different city size. And you can see that when the pandemic hit, large cities and London in particular, footfall fell much further down than in small cities. And partly as a result of that, when the economy reopened last summer, footfall bounced back much quicker in small and medium-sized city centres than in London, where it remained fairly flat. It increased a bit, but it remained fairly flat. And we know that the reason for that has to do with remote working patterns and the fact that not all places have, the same labour market characteristics and composition. And in some places, there's just a higher share of people who can whose job can be done from home. And so this looks at this relationship between the footfall recovery here and the estimate share of workers who can work from home. And you see that in places here, for instance, like large cities or places like Milton Keynes, Oxford, for instance, there's a high share of the population whose job can be done from home. And in these places, the footfall recovery was quite low, and it's the opposite in cities in the top left corner here, like Mansfield and Barnsley and Wakefield, for instance. So that tells us a lot about the recovery and what that means for the likelihood of these places bouncing back to where they were, and also of the importance of workers coming back. And I'll get more detail on that in a minute. But something else I think which is interesting we learned with the footfall data is that it's not all about the office and about remote working patterns. So this is the same, it shows the same footfall recovery over time, but this time with a breakdown for nighttime, weekend, and workers' activity. And what we see, and this is the average for all cities, but we've seen that across many places, is that although workers were quite reluctant to go back to the office or to the city centre over time, we've seen weekend activity bouncing back much more than weekday activity, and same for nighttime. So I think the interesting thing with nighttime, for instance, and the fact that nighttime activity is above workers' activity, means that these are people who did not just stay in town after work for a drink for those who were working still in the city centre, but it's people who came into the city centre just for the evening. And so that tells us, I think, something interesting about the role that city centres play and how that maybe has been affected by the pandemic. Now moving on to what we learned about on the spend data. So, I mean, we know that it's physical stores and bricks and mortar spend which has taken the hit the most. So this chart is a bit tricky, but I'll talk you through it. So it looks at the evolution of spend over time across all city centres since February 2020. So the first interesting thing is the light chart line here, which looks at total spend by urban residents. And interestingly, and I think it's the first thing to notice, that overall spend at the scale of the city has recovered, which in itself is quite telling, given that we're in a recession. So that in itself is quite telling. But then we know that it's physical stores which have taken the hit the most, and this is shown here in the purple line, which looks at the offline non-essential spend by urban residents, and it's dropped quite a lot, and it hasn't fully recovered to 100. And then the final thing that we've seen on this data is when you isolate the city center spend, which is the dark green line, you see that city center spend remained well below the overall city level recovery. And so what that tells us is that it may be local centers which have driven the recovery the most. And that tells us something quite interesting about the role that high streets in central locations play, and how they will recover or not recover in the next few months. And we've seen something similar when looking at specific city regions like Greater Manchester, for instance, where we saw that some local high streets outside of Manchester city centre recovered a bit more than the centre of the cities, which is driven partly by work from home patterns and the reliance of the centre of the city on people coming on a daily basis to spend money on a sandwich or a coffee after work. And then something that's also been discussed a lot in the past few months is the impact of COVID on online shopping. So I think the overall pattern we've seen is that there's been a noticeable but not dramatic increase in online shopping. So before the pandemic, online shopping accounted for 19% of all spend, and it grew by 4 percentage points. So it's now 23%. And that looks at the breakdown for each city, and it shows the share of all spend for online shopping before the pandemic and how that increased by September 2020. So you see, for instance, that before the pandemic, I think Cambridge was the capital of online shopping, and it's still very much the case. And you see that in some cities, online shopping increased more than in others. So if you look at, for instance, I think Cardiff is a place where the share of online shopping increased by quite a lot, same for Blackburn, but in other places like Oxford, for instance, it remained fairly muted compared to other cities. And so I think the interesting thing that we've seen in this data is that online shopping is not the real problem. And I think there's been a lot of discussion around the threat that online shopping represents for the high streets. But when you look at some high streets across the country, we've seen that they're not all struggling, and some of them are performing quite well. So and that ties up to what Henry was saying earlier about the key role of local income and how much money people have to spend in a given area. And so you see here that there's not a real relationship between the share of spend that's made online, that was pre-pandemic, and the share of high street units that's vacant, so vacancy rates on the high street. And if anything, it seems to be the opposite. If you look at cities like Brighton, Oxford, and London, for instance, they have quite a high share of all spend that's made online, but they have a very low vacancy rate on the high street. And it's the opposite in cities like Blackpool and Burnley, for instance. Now, obviously, places like Oxford, for instance, are a bit outliers because they're very touristic. But that still tells us something about maybe the importance, not necessarily of or the threat of online shopping, but saying that what matters the most is local spending power. And we know that there's a strong relationship between wages and the share of high street units which are vacant, which is related to what Henry was talking about earlier. And so what we know is that what really matters is the nature of the local labor market is key. And so this looks at the share of city centre jobs in exporting businesses, and in particular to define what we call strong city centres. What matters is share of city centres in exporting jobs that are high skilled. So these are company jobs, in software development, in finance, in law, and all these, in places here are performing quite well and have a low vacancy rate because they have a high footfall and a high number of people with high paid jobs, which then kind of trickles down money into local businesses like restaurants, pubs and cafes, for instance. And so this is the key thing for the recovery as well. And something on mixed use. So we also know from pre-pandemic data that successful high streets moved away from reliance on retail. And so that's what's on the table here, which looks at the share of food and leisure as a share of high street services, and the link with vacancy on the high street. And the city centres that we define as being strong had a much higher share of the high street services which were dedicated to food and leisure, compared to weaker city centres where retail is more prevalent. And so pre-pandemic, we know that strong city centres had more than 60% of all their commercial floor space allocated to offices and 80% to retail. And it's the opposite in weaker city centres. Now, obviously, the thing that has to, to be said here is that it's the nature of the jobs and the fact that these places attract these high-skilled jobs which drive these trends and not the other way around. And so it's because there are enough people willing to spend money for food and leisure, for instance, that these businesses exist in the first place. And it's also the reason why there's more office space. But that tells us about the importance of some of these factors and the fact that many of these places sort of even before the pandemic anticipated the fact that successful high streets need to have a sort of diversified offer on the high street and offer something that we can't find at home. So in terms of concluding thoughts and next steps, so in the short term for many high streets, the priority is to protect jobs for hospitality businesses, and so it's important that schemes like the furlough scheme, for instance, continue as long as restrictions are in place. And in the short term as well, there's loads of things to do in terms of attracting people back to the high street. And that includes a number of measures like encouraging public transport usage. And that means a number of things, because we've seen, looking at traffic data, for instance, that there's a risk that, some of the behavioral change we've seen in the past few months kind of continue after the pandemic is over. And so there's a need to re-encourage public transport usage. And also maybe making it cheaper. So I think especially if you consider people who will only go a few days a week, for instance, there's a case for maybe part-time season tickets, for instance. And then there's also changes to make to the way we design the high street in the public realm. We know that pedestrianizing central areas work quite well. We know it's quite successful to attracting people, and we also know there's research on that. That quite often when you pedestrianize a given area, that people tend to stay longer and therefore they tend to spend more money. So, these type of measures are sometimes seen as a threat by local businesses themselves, but actually they're quite positive in terms of impact. And then some of the temporary changes that we've seen on many city centres, in the past few months can be made permanent if, we know they're successful. And that's using spatial planning powers to encourage, more efficient use of space, maybe helping businesses operating on pavements and parking spaces, for instance. But now in the medium to long term, I guess the findings or the lessons from these findings is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. And, smaller and larger city centres face very different challenges. In smaller city centres, they might be bouncing back quicker, but some of them may be bouncing back to a weaker position. And so the challenges that they faced pre-pandemic are still there. And in larger city centres, they will be bouncing back to quite a successful or quite a strong position. But the challenges for them will be to attract workers back or to adapt if they don't. And so, like I said, in weaker city centres, the pre-pandemic challenges remain. And beyond the impact of the pandemic, the question is, why were some of them declining in the first place? And that has to do with retail and local spending power. So the need here is to attract these high-paid jobs, ensuring that there's enough office space allocated for these businesses to locate in a given centre, investing in skills, and moving away from over-reliance on retail by ensuring more mixed use in different high streets. And And then in larger, more successful city centres, the key thing will be workers returning to the office, but there will be a need to adapt to maybe more flexible working patterns. So there's a few things that can be done here in terms of making sure that, you know, empty office space is reused even temporarily, for instance, maybe turning vacant shops into offices, or into residential when that's needed, and maybe some, you know, PDR conversion and a new Class E in the new planning classification may help with that. There's also a key thing with taking control and ownership of assets within some city centres and making sure that, you know, no empty space remains empty for too long. And there's also, especially on the sort of flexible working patterns angle, making sure that, you know, businesses and office space adapt to a more sort of, to a provision of a more flexible office space, like co-working spaces, for instance. So there's, you know, loads of things to do, and I'll stop here because I'm probably over time, but I'll be really, you know, keen in hearing more about you, and also maybe some like good examples and good practice from different local areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Valentine. So I'm going to open it up for questions in a minute. Please do put your questions in the chat box. First, I wanted to ask Mario De Conte, who is here from CLG, MHCLG, if he wanted to kind of give a first response to the presentations and give us a bit of information about how government's thinking about this, if that's all right, Mario.
Hopefully, I'm trying to turn my camera on. Okay, yeah, it's just on now, and hopefully I'm muted as well. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, Meg, happy to do that. I think I'm gonna take this in kind of reverse order. So talk about Valentine's presentation first in terms of the evidence, in terms of the recovery and what we know in terms of how people have responded and how places have responded. So really interesting to see your analysis, Valentine, and I suppose in one way it's not too surprising in terms of understanding that smaller centres have recovered more quickly than larger cities, particularly I suppose when you look at, as you've kind of pointed out, the number of people who can potentially work from home relative to smaller places. I suppose the other factor I think is really important in that consideration is both domestic and international tourism as well. So the degree to which places are able to people are able to move around to visit, and obviously London, Oxford, Cambridge would obviously be places where both domestic and international tourists would be looking to go to. I think in terms of the other points that you made, which I think were really interesting, and in terms of looking at the degree to which places are successful, and I think the message which came across to me was those places which are able to adapt to the kind of structural change and the change in the nature of demand are the ones which are likely to be most successful. And it's really interesting to see that set out in terms of the hard data, in terms of vacancy rates, and then the kind of the mix of venues that a place has to offer. And I think that is a key message in terms of thinking about the success of a high street. It will need to adapt to the changing nature of demand to make sure that it has the right kind of opportunities and facilities to attract people, which will then obviously generate more footfall, but also more job opportunities and incomes as well. And I said, I think those are the kind of key messages for me in terms of the analysis that you've done. And I think that's true both in terms of the response to the pandemic, but also kind of the longer term recovery which places have been looking to make. Kind of moving on more broadly to think about wider policy. So it's probably worthwhile saying that I'm not a policy official, so my capacity within MHCLG is on the evidence side. So we produce the evidence, I and my team produce the evidence to support policy on high streets and town centres. So I'm not here to talk about from the policy perspective. But in terms of Henry's presentation, we are planning a monitoring and evaluation of the Towns and High Streets Fund. That's a £3.6 billion fund, which is supporting high streets and town centres. And in terms of the framework which you set out there, Henry, I think that's the framework that we're looking to operationalise. So looking and trying to understand what the impact is on people of that investment, what the impact on places is of that investment, and what the impact of that investment is on business as well. So that's the framework that we're looking at. And I suppose it's interesting that you said, Henry, that high streets are a sign of success of a place rather than the cause of it. But I suppose I may challenge that a little bit to say, well, actually, there must be some kind of interaction between those two. So if you have a successful high street, that was obviously kind of sales generating more opportunities and potential high levels of both, I suppose, well-being, but also high overall economic activity as well. But I do take your point. The challenge of actually trying to turn around a high street where the underlying conditions are very, very difficult, I think is a challenge. And as I said, we are developing a monitoring and evaluation framework to assess what the impact of the high streets and the towns fund is, and we will also be looking to try and determine the degree to which those underlying factors impact on the degree to which the investment has been successful. So obviously, for the high streets, there are 72 places which will be investing on their high street. That obviously gives us a significant data source to consider which places have been successful, what types of investments have been successful, and whether places who have carried out a similar kind of investment have achieved the same level of results, or were there kind of underlying conditions which made it more difficult for those particular places. So that's something which we're looking to do, but obviously that will be sometime in the future. But obviously that framework that you've set out there, Henry, I think is an effective way of kind of thinking about how we may assess those impacts. The other thing I suppose is probably worthwhile saying, but I suppose it's kind of captured in your people places, but how do people feel about their high streets? So what's the impact about how people feel about it, and how the high street actually meets their needs, which is also something we will be looking to also incorporate within that analysis. And with that, Meg, I'll finish, but happy to take any questions if anybody has any questions on what I've said. But we should open up the floor to people to ask their questions.
Thanks, Mario. That people, business, place framework that's so useful came, of course, from the industrial strategy. One of the legacies of the industrial strategy that we found super useful, and a lot of our website is now organized around that because it's just very clear and helpful. I have a few questions now for different panelists, and I'm going to ask you, the first one is from Sally Agus. Sally, if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question, please. Hi.
Yes, hi. Really, really interesting presentation.
Good.
One of the things that we have noted, I work as an interim, so I work all over the country. And one of the things that I've noticed is that as the high streets have become deserted, so we have gangs of youths on bikes absolutely taking over the high street. And in attempts to resurrect the high street, these have become a really intimidating factor. How on earth do you build crime out of high streets is my question. Thank you.
That's a good question, and that's a tough one.
Sorry.
No, it's fair enough. I think it's very much true everywhere. Henry, do you want to say a word about that? I mean, I think it's a little bit out of the remit of our What Works Center.
Yeah, so it is. So I'm not going to make up an answer, but I think I will take that away, Sally. If you want to contact me afterwards, I don't know what the What Works Centre for Crime says about that, and I would hope they would have something to say. So I think it's a great question, but I don't know, and I'd rather give you an evidence-based answer rather than making something up. So we do have a sister What Work Centre that is focused on crime, and I'm very happy to go away and pose that question to them. So if you can I guess we'll have your contact details off in the participant list, but I'll go away and ask. It's a good question, and I don't know the answer.
Be helpful, because there's no point having a lot of disposable income to spend if people won't even go there.
Yep. No, it's a great question. So I'd rather give you an evidence-based answer if I can find one for you. So let me ask What Works Crime what they have and get back to you.
Thank you.
It's also interesting because there's a big timing element about that, that you don't want an answer that says, oh, make 1 million changes to your high street that are going to cost a lot of money and, and take years to implement. So that's another aspect of it, is what can you do quickly. The What Works Center for Crime is really interesting. What Works Center for Policing, I think they're called.
Oh, wow.
Thanks for that, Sally. Andrew Osborne has a question. Andrew, who's from Ashford in Kent. Andrew, are you there? Hi.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Meg. My question was really about, the property market's obviously looking at town centres, and obviously critical for them is around how they realise sort of investment value and things like that within their assets. Certainly we've seen Marks and Spencers and Debenhams leave Ashford High Street in the last few years. Vacancy rates go up as part of that, and quite a lot of the solution that certainly the property industry is coming back with is residential and more residential as sort of a driver for high streets. And I can see that to a factor, bringing it back and making them into neighbourhoods. It can help with the crime issue that I think the previous question was about. But I suppose lots of people are putting this on the back of the fact that, residential will then drive footfall back into the area and spend back into the area. And I was wondering whether there was sort of any evidential base that sort of talks about the introduction of residential into town centres and whether that is actually having an economic stimulus.
It's a really interesting question. Valentine, do you want to talk about that a little bit first? And then maybe Henry will have something to say as well.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question on the residential aspect of it. So that's something I briefly mentioned at the end of the presentation, but it's a difficult one because there's kind of pros and cons for it. And we've been looking at the potential, impact of PDR and the new E-class, which would kind of allow to have more residential within some city centres. And the problem is that, so it's a solution in some places, but it's also, if you consider, successful city centres, places like London, Manchester, or plenty of city centres, Cambridge, these places are facing sort of competition for space between residential, offices, and commercial retail, for instance. And so in these places, the risk of having more residential is that it takes out some space for offices. And then in weaker city centres, it's a different problem, but the point of having more residential is not a solution in itself, because you want to have people who want to live there. And to do that, you need to have jobs first. So, you can't attract people to live in a given city centre if it's not an attractive place in itself to work or to, play or have leisure and all that. So there's kind of an interesting dynamic between, what needs to come first. And so I guess more residential is a solution in some kind of residual, areas which are facing a high housing crisis and need, housing prices to go down, but do have some extra space on brownfield land, for instance, for that, without taking too much on what should be allocated to the production side of things and the role city centres play as places of production and consumption. So yeah, that's part of my answer.
Should I come in on this? Ashford Kent or Ashford Surrey, out of interest, Andrew? Not that it's going to inform my answer, but...
Sorry, no, it's Ashford in Kent.
Oh, I grew up in Folkestone. That's why I was...
If you go on the high-speed line down through Kent, if you're travelling on Eurostar, Ashford's one of the stops. About 38 minutes out of St Pancras and about sort of 50, 60 miles outside of London.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I cut across you. I was saying I know it well because I grew up in Folkestone.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
So let me say how I think about this. I'll make a couple of points. So firstly, it's context specific. So I don't think I can give you a general answer, but here is what I would be looking at. So I think Valentine hinted at this. I firstly would want an assessment of the residential property market that gave me a feeling for how we were doing on residential supply. And the reason why I say that is that I think you want to know what the likely occupancy patterns look like for the new residential that you're building. You then work from that to likely incomes. And from that, using sort of figures, Valentine's given us some of them on what proportion of people's income after housing costs they spend locally, you start to get a feeling for what might be a realistic shift in the demand that you will see for the high street. So I think you have to work it out. I don't think you can get a general answer. I think it's that sort of pattern of work through. What's the likely occupancy rate? What kind of people are likely to occupy it? What's their income, and what's their income going to be net of housing? And then you take that and you interact it with what we know about share of spend that is likely to go local. And that gives you a feeling, it's a straightforward calculation then of what you think this is going to do to your local retail spend by benchmarking that against your current levels. And I mean, that would be the sort of concrete way that I would get the first input into thinking about what the impact is likely to be in terms of local spend. Now, here's the trickier thing that I don't know how to give you an answer on, which is that there must be a complicated interaction here where too much commercial to resi makes the retail location non-viable, a local retail location non-viable. And there, I hate to say it, but I don't think we have good numbers on sort of what that, where that looks, where that the sort of optimal ratio or number of commercial properties would fall. So I think that's a more difficult question to answer. The thing I would say on that is that 2 more points, and then I'll let other people ask questions. I think that we've probably oversupplied. If you think about the structural shifts that we're seeing, we are probably oversupplied on certain parts of the retail market in certain places. So I think that. I don't know how many high streets you have, but if you went and looked at the ONS numbers, they have this what do they call them? Lighthouse projects that sort of mapping out how many high streets you have, although you'll probably know this anyhow from local, from your local knowledge. As part of a broad strategy of consolidation, that's also, I think, where the commercial resi switches fit in. So it's that local income calculation. Where do they fit in a general strategy about reducing the supply of commercial if I feel that the area is oversupplied? And so there it's going to depend on which of your high street locations you're seeing the shift on. The final thing I would say, which is very COVID specific, but which I'm really worried about, is I really worry we're going to see overconversion, because I think that for cash flow reasons, landlords are desperate to get income in, and that could drive commercial to residential switches that are not actually long run a good idea. I think this really worries me in the places that Valentine highlighted as having taken the biggest hit from working from home, because I think that people are far too pessimistic about the likely return rates to the office. And so I do think, and it's unfortunate, I mean, as someone that's called for greater flexibility in the planning system for a long time, the irony that the greater flexibility is coming in at the moment where the market has faced a huge amount of uncertainty. And for the first time in ages, I'm actually slightly worried that we might get too much conversion from commercial to residential in places that would otherwise be viable, and that then pushes us beneath that threshold that I talked about. So I don't know, I mean, that's the sort of analytical way I think that I would be approaching it. And like I said, I'm very happy, feel free to reach out afterwards if there are aspects of that sort of work through that that are unclear. But I think that's the way that I would approach at least getting some evidence on what the likely impacts are. And I do think the answer is going to depend hugely on place to place and where it fits within your broader high street offer.
There's also different kinds of housing, isn't there? There seems to be a big trend toward the student housing. And when I worked for the city corporation back in the 90s, they had a morbid fear of any kind of residential uses going into the city area because it's so hard to undo residential, and they were always trying to pack in as much office use as possible. That's a very, very interesting question, and every place obviously will have their own answer. I have a question from Isabel Nichols. Are you still here, Isabel? And can you unmute yourself and ask your question? It's a good one.
Hello there, I'm here, thank you. Yeah, my name's Isabel Nichols. I work in Redcar and Cleveland Borough Council up in Teesside. And I've been really interested to sort of see the statistics about the importance of having office workers in a town centre to the sort of vitality of the high street. And we've recently done our town investment plan for the Towns Fund, which is very much based on Tees Works and the Freeport, which has been recently announced in very close proximity to Redcar's town centre, but certainly not in walking distance. It's a couple of miles away, but our sort of vision is that those new employment locations see Redcar as their town centre, and that helps our town centre to grow. But yeah, in terms of the shopping, retail uses, that kind of thing in the nighttime economy, but also in terms of residential. And I just wondered if you had any sort of comment on the proximity that you need those employment uses in to really see a benefit.
Muted, Meg. Meg, you muted. I'm not sure who you were trying to call on there.
Sorry, Henry, do you want to go ahead?
I was going to ask Valentine. No. So my gut. So paralleling this from what we know about the sort of productivity effects, measurable productivity effects that we get. So there's a large literature that looks at how quickly productivity benefits of clustering fade with distance. I'm being honest, you are beyond the boundary of what we'd usually think for the things that involve face-to-face, because they need that sort of casual, interaction, their smaller distance. The reason why I'm just being a bit cautious there is because I don't know what the evidence would specifically say on the retail demand from them. Although even there, my guess is that 2 miles is probably too big for generating significant retail spillover. So it may be that you're looking really more about getting that benefits from that off of the residential locations of the employees rather than the work location of the employees. But I think that's again, it's about, you get a feeling there for the fact that I'm giving you a way of trying to figure that out in your specific context rather than pretending that I really know the answer. So I would be breaking it down saying, what do I think the employment numbers on site are likely to be? How many of those jobs are new versus existing? And then I would work back from that to the behaviours that Valentine broke down. So it feels to me that you're not going to get much lunchtime there. You might get some nightlife, right? Because and then, so that's using their employment location as the base for working that out. And then I would flip it round and say, if I think it's going to generate additional jobs, what do I think the residential pattern of those additional jobs look like? And then I think you work from that in the same way that I did for Andrew, right? What are the numbers? What do we think the income levels are going to be like? What does the spend look like? So I don't think I can give you the answer, but that is the framework that I would be using to try and get a first pass handle on what I thought this would do in terms of retail demand at different times of the day. I don't know if that's clear. I'm very happy to clarify either now or offline. I don't know whether Valentine's got anything to add.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to that is taking into account the nature of the place and the fact that demand for retail or leisure or like restaurants and cafes very much depends between places, and some places are much more reliant on weekend trade, which is therefore much more independent from workers going to the office or to the workplace every day, and then some places are much more reliant on weekday spend, and that tends to be larger city centres, which have a higher share of people who work in an office, for instance. So I think that's probably another element to take into account in these decisions.
Thank you both. That's really interesting.
Thanks, Isabel. I just want to let my speakers know we've got 4 more questions, and they're all really good ones, so I'd like to get to them if we can. Next, we have Michael Coughlin. Are you still here, Michael? You're muted now. Or we can't hear you. We can see you. It's not working right now. I'm going to move on, Michael, and maybe you can sort yourself. Actually, I'm going to read your question if that's all right, from the chat box, because Michael was asking about the returning high streets to their historic uses, and what is the role potentially for local health and community initiated uses and assets in generating footfall and vibrancy in the high streets. I know there have been some really interesting things done with anchor stores in some places. And I was wondering, Michael was wondering if either of you had anything to say about that. Sorry, Michael. Can't hear you.
So local community and health, was that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll separate it out into 2, Michael. My feeling is that the local community assets, generally speaking, falls more into my sort of Rachel Wolf non-economic benefits. So I think they can be hugely important, don't get me wrong, but I've sort of said this multiple times now, but again, I'm not quite sure what local community assets you're talking about, but here is my calculation, right? So, yeah. Oh, there we go. Suddenly we've got you. What do we expect? Yeah, we got you. There we go.
Thank you.
So, what realistically might we expect the visitor numbers to be for those local community assets, and what do we think the spend would be, right? And I'm not quite sure what kind of local community asset you're talking about, but that's the way I'd work it down. Now, if you take something like a local community, a pub, those things can be hugely important, community anchors, etc. But when you work back, to what we're talking about in terms of the employment impact of those, or the wages impact, hugely important for the bartenders, etc. that work there. But the numbers get away from you pretty quickly, right? The profits that you'd be talking about for the pub, the wages that will go to the bar staff, they are not going to generate large employment impact. Yeah. But that doesn't mean they're not hugely important, right? For the community and the kind of things that Rachel Wolf is talking about. But that would sort of be in my non-economic. The health one is trickier because, of course, the health one does have the potential to generate quite large employment impacts, depending on what kind of service provision you're talking about, right? If it's a GP, it's those sort of footfall numbers, but people that go to the GP are maybe having a coffee or whatever, but they're not sitting around spending, so again, I think you could work it down on that side. If it's something larger, like a community health facility, then that does start to sort of fit into Valentine's sort of camp of things, where those people go out, they want lunches, they want after dinner drinks, etc. And you can start to work down from the employment numbers that you might be talking about, which you would have a better assessment of. Now, the one caution I would give on this is nearly always, if you're talking at the local authority level over things that you have control on, you will be moving those from some other employment site. And so I think that any assessment of health for example, as part of that strategy, does need to think about the fact that those negative, the positive effects that you get in location 1 will be at the expense of negative locations, negative impacts in location 2. Look, I still think that, again, so my feeling is you have to have that as part of a broader consolidation strategy. Right, which is saying, look, we're actually going to bring, health A, health B, community activity C, etc., and that is we're trying to use that to create the critical mass, but while being aware that you're creating negative things elsewhere. But that's the sort of analytical approach I would take for starting to break it down. Look, of course, there are some unknowns in there, but I think that's where I would go at it.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Tim.
Next we have David Smith. Oh, I think David Smith may have left. He's gone gray on the in the chat box. So I'm going to move on to Bill Hicks from Thames Valley Berkshire Lep. Bill, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your excellent question?
Sure. Thank you, Meg. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I suppose my question to Henry and Valentine as well, if they had £830 million to spend on the high street, where would they spend it?
That's the real question, isn't it? Valentine, do you want to start?
That's a hard one. I mean, the key thing is investing in skills, but I guess it depends. It depends what you do with that money and who you are, and therefore what you can do. But I guess, yeah, I mean, the short answer is investing in skills and ensuring that, that you increase local spending power, and then you kind of increase the amount of money that can circulate in the local economy. But related to that, I think it's ensuring that there's enough office space for businesses and these, newly skilled people to start a business, whether it's a large company or a startup. So the more concrete kind of answer would be to repurpose some of the maybe empty space on the high street, for instance, as offices, in parallel to increasing skills. I guess that would be my answer.
Yeah, I a little bit shy away from this. Sometimes, Bill, I have a lecture. I have a picture of me, in academic dress, pointing at something, saying, recipe for success 1, 2, 3. I think this is an area where really context matters, right? I mean, I do believe in local decision makers. I think what I've tried to do, and what Valentine stuff is useful for, is I think trying to give people the sort of analytical tools for working through what the High Street Task Force sort of would call their repositioning. It's what's the analytical work that we need to be doing to help us figure out how to spend that 800 and whatever it is million. I think the overarching thing, though, I would say that I would definitely, be paying more attention to, and it's really difficult, is the fact that we do need to consolidate. That I suspect in many places that we need efforts to consolidate the high street offer in less locations than we currently have, if we want those high street locations to be long-term successful. And I think that will apply in lots of places. So while I'm not going to say, I would start with that sort of, I need to adjust the long run structural trend. Valentine pointed out that we've seen a 4 percentage point uptick in online sales. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but it took us 20 years to get to the 19%, right? So, I mean, it is a huge uptick. We're seeing, similarly, although I am fairly bullish about people returning to their offices, the percentage of people who were, regularly working from home was 5%, and it's now 45%. Where do I think the future lies? Somewhere between those two numbers. And all right, I think closer to the 5% than the 45% that we're currently seeing. But those are two huge structural shifts that I would have at the heart of whatever my strategy was. But then I think it's the sort of nuts and bolts stuff that you've got to work on place by place, that I did in my answers to colleagues from Ashford and from Tees, etc. I think that's where I'd go.
Thank you. Very useful.
Thanks. That was a really good question. And I'm just going to, Matthew Kershaw has offered a follow-up, which is 50 million pounds a year better than 830 million pounds all at once. And I think the answer to that is definitely yes. And we dream on about the day when we'll have long-term guaranteed budgets in that amount.
Well, I think this is, it's all infrastructure spend as well, right? And it's all capital, sorry, or lots of it is capital. And, yes, there is some capital stuff that needs adjusting, but actually lots of the adjustment that I think needs to come does not involve capital expenditure. It involves revenue expenditure to support businesses and workers to adapt. So, we know why we always end up with capital. But I would, if I was government, if I was the Chancellor, it wouldn't all be capital. There you go.
We have one final question from Jane Hunts about meanwhile use. Jane, are you still there? And can you unmute yourself and ask your question about meanwhile uses? I don't see Jane. But I will say, Jane was asking whether we have a one-pager that councils can use to encourage landlords to use spaces for meanwhile use. And I can tell you that we don't have a one-pager for that. I know you say that business rates is a big selling point. Oh, there you are, Jane. Can we hear you? But I think meanwhile use is a really tricky one, and some landlords are really, really worried about letting people into their vacant buildings on a meanwhile basis. But certainly case studies of where it's been done successfully, I think, are always really helpful in convincing landlords to kind of be a little more flexible. I don't know if either of you, Valentine or Henry, have anything else to say about meanwhile uses. Obviously, they really do help make the place look better.
Well, it's tricky. I mean, I have no idea how to get landlords to be more responsive on this. I think that's actually probably is a question that would be better addressed to the High Street Task Force and the experts that they have. So maybe make that's a follow-up we could do for Jane.
Sorry, I lost sound.
So Jane, we can hear you now. So I think, in terms of everything that we talked about on this call, in anything, so there's a slight irony here. Meanwhile uses have got to be quite helpful, because I'm coming back to the answer that I gave to Andrew Osborne in Ashford, where, if what we're worried about is, for example, landlords switching from commercial to resi because they're worried about cash flow issues, etc., and that is not actually necessarily the right long run choices, then anything temporary in terms of meanwhile uses is going to be helpful, right? Because it prevents a structural adjustment that might be in the wrong direction. I just don't know enough about what the literature says, but it feels to me like that's something that the High Street Task Force you might be well placed to answer. So we should have a look. The glib point I was going to make was, it's got to be more important than ever, because there's, when uncertainty goes up, the option value of being able to wait a bit increases a lot. And so I think the option value of flexibility and waiting at the moment is huge. I think that's true for both local authority decisions, but it's also true for landlord decisions. So I think, if I was a landlord at the moment, at least the case for meanwhile use is clearly strengthened, right, as a result of the huge uncertainty that we face. But I've noted that as a follow-up. I genuinely don't know what evidence there is, but we can have a look.
We should look at it. Yeah, I think it would be really good to look at.
Yeah. I mean, we've looked at, the things we've done a one pager where we talk about the building will be occupied. They will cover insurance. So for security reasons, we will also support any meanwhile use people that go in to do with business support, so that they can do market research on the footfall for prospective longer term tenants. But
the thing I would say on this, actually, Jane, it might be worth contacting our head of evidence, Victoria Sutherland, because this sounds like the kind of thing where if we're providing information to businesses, actually going to a bunch of local authorities and experimenting a bit with, you know, what evidence that we, you know, what do we say to them? It's sort of in that behavioural insights, you know, something that central government does a lot. But I think, you know, there really could be something here, and it would be quite quick, sort of saying, all right, you know, let's experiment with, you know, how we make the case to these businesses and see what the response rate looks like on in terms of allowing it. I think that's something that we could possibly we could actually get up and running fairly quickly, and really be seeing, you know, what we get there in the next, you know, sort of few months if we did that.
I mean, yeah, just as a quick follow-up, you know, Plymouth, we'd be keen to be involved in any kind of, you know, research modelling like that, and we've just recently received £1 million Interreg bid, and one of the 4 work packages for that is city centre renaissance, focusing on meanwhile use. So it's a big driver for us. So
it's a good space. Meg, let's
you.
make sure we follow up on that.
Yeah, put you in touch with Victoria.
Thank you.
Valentine?
So that's not something we've been working on, so I don't have that much to add, but it's something I really want to, you know, have a look at for future research, and I'll feedback to, you know, the team on that, because I know we'll be doing a project on high streets at some point later this year using kind of updated vacancy rates from this company called the Local Data Company, and I think they have data on, you know, what spaces have been used kind of temporarily during the pandemic. So it'd be really interesting to see, you know, how that played out across pace, and what the impact has been on, you know, overall footfall, for instance, or spend levels.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Why don't we end a little bit early, and then we can all go get a cup of coffee or something. Thank you everyone for coming and for the brilliant questions. Please do get in touch with both the Center for Cities and the What Works Center for Local Economic Growth. There's a lot more information on both of our websites about all of these issues. The slides will be available. I think we'll see if we can circulate them to everyone, but also the video will be up on the website. So if there's anyone on your team who you think would benefit from watching it, please do make use of that. And we have a variety of resources that we can offer at the What Works Center for Local Economic Growth. We can help you with evaluations. We can talk to you about the evidence base, and we run all kinds of workshops. And there's also a number of resources on our website, so do go and have a look. And thanks again for coming. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye.